The syringe was already in her hand. The needle hovered 3 inches from Atlas's foreleg, and nobody in that room was breathing. Captain Mason Reed, a man who had walked through firefights without flinching, was on his knees on a cold clinic floor, pressing his forehead against the skull of a dying dog. His shoulders were shaking. His voice was gone. 8 years of war, 8 years of blood and dust and impossible odds, and this was the moment that broke him. Then Atlas moved. Not a twitch, not a reflex. The dog lifted both front legs, slowly, painfully, and wrapped them around Mason's neck. The veterinarian froze. The needle never touched skin, because what happened next shouldn't have been possible. If this story already has you holding your breath, stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since midnight. It came down in thin diagonal sheets against the windows of the Silver Harbor Military Animal Clinic, tapping a sound like static on an old radio, constant, directionless, impossible to tune out. The parking lot was empty except for 2 government vehicles and a mud-streaked pickup truck that hadn't moved in 11 hours. Inside, the building smelled like antiseptic and wet concrete and something Mason Reed couldn't name, something that lived in the back of his throat and refused to leave. He sat in a plastic chair outside the ICU observation room with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded together the way his mother used to sit in church, like the posture alone might make a difference. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. He hadn't slept the night before that. His uniform was wrinkled, his jaw was covered in 3 days of growth, and his eyes had that particular flatness that comes not from tiredness, but from something deeper, something that doesn't have a clinical name. He'd been in this chair for 6 hours. Through the observation window, he could see Atlas. The Belgian Malinois lay on his side on a padded examination table, chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular pulls. An IV line ran into his left foreleg. 2 monitoring leads were taped to his ribs. A thin fleece blanket, somebody on the night staff had added it without being asked, was tucked loosely around his lower body. Atlas was 67 pounds of operational precision, muscle memory, and scar tissue. In the field, he moved like water through a rock field, fast, quiet, certain. He could clear a building in the dark without a command. He could track a scent trail that was 3 days cold across a mountain ridge. He had bitten through body armor. He had walked through smoke without hesitating while grown men froze. Now he looked small. That was the thing that kept hitting Mason sideways. Not the machines, not the IV, just how small Atlas looked on that table, with his eyes closed and his breathing wrong. He's not supposed to look like that. Mason rubbed his face with both hands and stood up, walked to the window, and pressed one hand flat against the glass. "Come on, buddy," he said very quietly. "Don't you check out on me." The duty vet, Dr. Evelyn Cross, found him there 10 minutes later. She was in her early 40s, sharp-faced and efficient, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a tablet tucked under one arm. She'd been with the clinic for 9 years. She'd seen handlers in this hallway before. She knew the look. "Captain Reed." She stopped beside him, not too close. "I need to talk to you." He didn't turn from the window. "Then talk." She let the tone slide. His baseline vitals have continued to drop over the last 4 hours. Respiratory rate is compensating, but his cardiovascular function, I read the chart. "Then you know what the numbers mean." He finally turned. His eyes moved to hers and stayed there. "I know what you want them to mean." Evelyn held his gaze. She was not easily intimidated, not by rank, not by grief, not by the particular brand of controlled anger that special operations soldiers wore like a second skin. She'd had this conversation before. She'd learned not to rush it. "The kindest thing," she started. "Don't." The word came out flat and clean. "Don't say that sentence to me." "Captain, he's 8 years old." Mason's jaw tightened. "He's not old. He's not terminal. There's no diagnosis on that chart that explains this progression." He gestured toward the window. "Something is wrong, and we haven't found it yet. That is different from him being finished." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "If we continue without intervention and his cardiac rhythm deteriorates further, then we intervene." Mason turned back to the window. "We find what's wrong, and we fix it. That's what we do. She studied him for a moment longer than she normally would. Then she looked through the glass at Atlas. And something in the dog's chart she'd reviewed 4 times that afternoon tugged at the edge of her thinking, something she'd flagged and set aside because the most obvious explanation had seemed sufficient. She pulled out the tablet. They let Mason into the room at 0300. It was against protocol for non-medical personnel to be present during an active monitoring period. Evelyn bent that rule without explaining why. Some calculations didn't show up on charts. Mason sat beside the table on a low stool. He didn't reach for Atlas immediately. He just sat close enough that the dog could smell him. That was important. He knew that. Scent was grounding. And he talked quietly. "You remember Kandahar," he said. Not a question. "That alley. You went in first because the geometry was bad and I called it wrong, and I knew it the second you were already moving." He exhaled slowly. "You cleared it before I could pull you back. Came out the other side and sat down and looked at me like, that's how it's done." Atlas's ear moved. One ear, the left one. Mason noticed. "Yeah." He leaned forward. "I see you." He put his hand gently on Atlas's head, and the dog's breathing changed. Not better, not worse, but different, like the body registering something important. "I am not letting them give up on you," Mason said. "So you don't get to give up either. That's an order." Atlas's eye opened. One eye, dark and amber and still completely present. Then, and this was the part that Mason would later struggle to explain to anyone who asked, the dog moved. Slowly, with obvious effort, he shifted his front legs. The IV line pulled taut. One of the monitor leads shifted. The machine chirped a warning note. Atlas wrapped both front legs around Mason's shoulders. It wasn't a flail. It wasn't a spasm. It was deliberate and certain, the way Atlas did everything, with a specific intention behind it, like the gesture had been thought through and decided on. Mason stopped breathing. The night tech who was watching from the doorway later described it as the most human thing she had ever seen an animal do. Usats. Dr. Evelyn Cross was at the nursing station when the alert came through on her tablet, the cardiac monitor showing the brief spike in movement activity. She walked back to the doorway and stopped. Mason was still on the stool. Atlas's paws were on his shoulders. The man's eyes were closed. His hand was pressed flat against the dog's ribs. Evelyn stood there for 30 seconds. Then she looked at her tablet, at the cardiac trace, at the respiratory numbers. And she noticed something she had not noticed before, or rather, something she had seen and categorized too quickly. The arrhythmia wasn't following the pattern she'd attributed to systemic decline. The rhythm disruption was localized. It spiked during specific positional changes. It smoothed briefly when Atlas was completely still. That's not cardiac disease, she thought. That's a mechanical interference. She called Dr. Hale. Victor Hale was the clinic's surgical specialist, a compact, methodical man in his 50s who wore his gray hair military short and spoke in sentences that were always exactly as long as they needed to be. He arrived at the clinic at 0347, still in street clothes, reading Evelyn's preliminary notes on his phone while he walked through the parking lot. By 0415, they had Atlas and imaging. Mason waited outside the imaging suite with his back against the wall and both arms crossed. Sergeant Briggs, his unit's comms NCO, and the closest thing Mason had to a best friend, showed up at 0430 with 2 coffees and no questions. He handed one to Mason. Mason took it. Neither of them said anything for a while. "Vitals were dropping," Mason finally said. "I know." She had the paperwork ready, the euthanasia consent form. She was going to... He stopped. She was going to ask me to sign it. Briggs looked down at his coffee. But she didn't. Because he moved. Mason's voice was very controlled. He reached up and... He stopped again, cleared his throat. Cross saw something in the readings. She called Hale in. "Hale's good." "I know he's good." "Then trust it." Mason looked at the closed door. "I've been trusting things for a long time, Briggs." "Yeah." Briggs took a long sip. "So is he." At 5:12, the imaging suite door opened. Evelyn came out first. Hale was behind her, holding a tablet with a scan image that Mason couldn't read from 10 feet away. He pushed off the wall. "Talk to me." Hale looked at him with the particular calm of someone who has delivered difficult news enough times to know how to control his own face. "We found something." He turned the tablet. On the screen was a cross-sectional scan. Ribs, tissue, the faint ghosting of organs. And there, nestled close to a dense white structure, was a small, bright, unmistakable sliver. "Metallic fragment," Hale said, "approximately 12 millimeters. Positioned inferior to the fourth rib on his right side, roughly 8 millimeters from the descending branch of his right coronary artery." Mason stared at the image. "It's been moving," Evelyn said. "Slowly. That's what's been causing the arrhythmia. Every time his body position changes, the fragment shifts. It's been compressing and releasing, creating an intermittent mechanical pressure on the arterial wall." The hallway was very quiet. "How long?" Mason asked. Hale's expression didn't change. "Based on tissue response and the degree of fibrous encapsulation, we estimate the fragment entered his body somewhere between 10 and 20 days ago." Mason went completely still. 10 to 20 days ago. He looked at the scan. He looked at the bright sliver of metal inside his dog. His mind went backward in time like rewinding a tape, and it landed, exactly where some part of him already knew it would land. Norhaven. The extraction mission in the mountains, the chaos of the descent. That single moment when Atlas had stumbled, a quick, barely there break in his stride, and then kept going. Mason had checked him at the objective rally point. No blood. No visible wound. Atlas had performed a post-mission assessment without any sign of distress. The dog had hidden it. "He took a hit," Mason said. "Not a question." Hale nodded slowly. "He did." "During the mission." That would be consistent with the timeline and the ballistic profile of the fragment. Mason set the coffee cup on the floor very carefully. He pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth for a moment. His eyes were dry, but there was something happening in his face that Briggs, standing slightly behind him, found very difficult to look at directly. Atlas had been hit during the mission. Atlas had finished the mission anyway. Atlas had ridden back in the vehicle and eaten his post-op rations and been checked over by the team medic, and not one person had found it because Atlas hadn't let them find it. He hadn't limped, he hadn't whined, he hadn't sat down when he should have. He'd done his job, he'd done Mason's job. "He can be operated on," Evelyn said carefully. "The fragment has to come out. There's no alternative. But given its proximity to the artery, what are the odds?" Mason said. Hale was honest. "With his current cardiovascular stress and the risk of intraoperative arterial compromise. Give me a number, Doc." A pause. 60-40. In his favor. If we move in the next 2 hours. Mason looked at the scan for one more second. "Schedule it," he said. "Right now." "Captain Reed." He took a bullet for me and kept working. His voice was absolutely level. "The least I can do is let you try to get it out." Well, they prepped Atlas at 0540. Mason was allowed in the prep room, which again was not protocol, and again nobody said anything about it. He stood beside the table while the anesthesia team worked. Atlas was sedated but not yet fully under, and his eyes kept finding Mason through the chemical haze, tracking, focusing, present. "You're not going to remember this part," Mason said quietly. "Which is fine. I'll remember enough for both of us." He put his hand on Atlas's head one more time. The dog's tail moved, weakly, once, against the table. Then the sedation deepened and the eyes closed, and they wheeled him through the OR doors, and the doors swung shut, and Mason was standing in an empty hallway with both hands at his sides and nothing to do. Briggs materialized beside him. "There's a break room at the end of the hall. I'm not going anywhere." "I know." Briggs leaned against the wall beside him. "I'll be here." Maasit. The surgery clock on the wall outside the operating room read 0612 when they began. Mason sat on the floor of the hallway with his back against the wall, knees pulled up, both hands resting on his knees. Other members of the unit, 6 of them in various states of rumpled uniform, some still in physical training gear, had arrived by 0630. Nobody had called a formation. Nobody had sent a group message. They just appeared, the way soldiers do when something matters. Sergeant First Class Devereaux brought a thermos of real coffee. Corporal Lynn brought a bag of gas station food that nobody ate but everyone was grateful for. They sat along both walls of the hallway, quiet and present, a line of big, capable people with nothing they could do except stay. The hallway lights hummed. Rain continued outside. At 7:41, an hour and 29 minutes in, the sound from inside the operating room changed. A machine alarm, high and urgent, cut through the muffled quiet. And then another. Mason was on his feet before he registered moving. Through the small circular window in the OR door, he could see movement, fast, controlled, the specific kind of organized urgency that medical teams drill for. Evelyn's voice, clipped and precise. Hale's hands moving with the focused speed of someone working against a clock that only he could see. The alarm continued for 41 seconds. Mason counted every one of them. Then it changed. The tone shifted, from alarm to caution to something slower, steadier. He pressed both palms flat against the door. "Don't you dare," he thought. "Don't you dare leave me standing in a hallway." Behind him, the 6 soldiers on the floor had all gotten to their feet without a word. They waited. The clock on the wall read 0743 when the secondary alarm silenced. And from inside the OR, the steady mechanical rhythm of a working heart monitor resumed. Slower than it should have been, thinner than he would have liked, but there. Present. Continuous. Mason let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest since the first alarm. Briggs put a hand on his shoulder. "He's still in." "Yeah." Mason's voice was rough. "He's still in." He didn't move from the door. At 9:01, Dr. Hale stepped out of the operating room. He had his mask pulled down around his neck and his gloves already off. He was holding a small sealed specimen container. Inside it, no larger than a thumbnail and irregular at both ends where it had deformed on impact, was a piece of metal. He held it up. "It's out," Hale said. Mason looked at the fragment, at this small, ugly piece of shaped metal that had been living inside his partner for 17 days. "He's stable," Hale continued. "ICU observation for the next 48 hours minimum. Recovery will be several weeks, but the fragment is out, the arterial wall is intact, and his heart rhythm is already normalizing." Someone in the hallway exhaled loudly. Someone else made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Mason took the specimen container from Hale and held it in his palm. He looked at it for a long time. "This is ballistic material," he said quietly. Hale nodded. "Consistent with small arms fragmentation." Mason's thumb moved over the lid of the container. "Then I need the ballistics team to take a look at this." His voice was very even. "Because I need to know exactly what weapon this came from." He looked up at Hale. "And whether it matches anything from Norhaven." Hale met his eyes. "Of course," Hale said carefully. "Is there a reason you suspect it might not match enemy ordnance?" The hallway was perfectly silent. Mason closed his fingers around the container. "Atlas was behind our own line of advance when he took the hit," he said. "He was between me and our rear security." Nobody spoke. "I need to know what this is," Mason said, "and I need to know where it came from." The rain outside had stopped. The hallway lights hummed. And in the ICU, 3 rooms away, a Belgian Malinois with a fresh surgical scar and a slowing, steadying heartbeat breathed in and out and did not know that the fragment pulled from his body had just started something none of them could yet see the end of. The specimen container sat in Mason's palm like it weighed nothing, but his hand didn't move. Hale watched him for a moment, then quietly excused himself back through the OR doors. The rest of the team in the hallway had the good sense not to fill the silence with words. Briggs stayed where he was, one shoulder against the wall, coffee gone cold in his hand. Mason turned the container over once. The fragment shifted inside it, catching the fluorescent light at a different angle. "Rear security on Norhaven," he said. Not to anyone specifically. "Who was running it?" Briggs's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That was Voss." Mason didn't say anything. "Mason," Briggs's voice was careful. "That's a serious direction to start thinking in." "I'm not thinking anything yet." Mason slipped the container into his breast pocket. I'm asking a question. He finally looked up. Get me Kowalski from the forensics attachment. Tell him I need a ballistic materials comparison run quietly, not through the unit channel. Off book. Off book. Briggs stared at him for a 3 count. Then he pushed off the wall and walked down the hallway without another word. Devereaux drifted close enough to speak quietly. You want company on whatever this is? I want you to go back to the barracks and act like nothing's happening. Mason's voice was even. That's more useful to me right now. Devereaux nodded once and went to round up the others. Mason stood alone in the emptying hallway with one hand pressed flat over his breast pocket, feeling the faint outline of the container through the fabric, and his mind running back over every minute of the Norhaven mission with the focus of a man who finally understood what he'd been looking at the whole time and couldn't unsee it. The Norhaven operation had been a personnel recovery mission. A 4-man intelligence team had gotten pinned in the mountain pass above the Varkin Valley after their extraction vehicle was disabled by an IED on Route Sabre. The window for recovery was 6 hours before the weather closed the air corridor entirely. Mason's unit had gone in on vehicles to the base of the ridge, then dismounted and moved 2 kilometers uphill on foot in the dark. Atlas had run point, working the air with his nose, while the 12-man element moved in staggered file behind him. The intelligence team was found in a stone shepherd's building at grid reference 114 Whiskey. All 4 alive, 2 with minor injuries. The link-up was clean. The withdrawal was not. 2 kilometers back down the ridge, Atlas had stumbled. Mason had seen it. A half-second break in the dog's movement, left front leg catching wrong, then correcting immediately. He'd called a short halt, knelt beside Atlas, run his hands over the dog's legs and torso, checked the paws for ice cuts. Nothing. Atlas had been completely still under his hands, breathing normally, watching the tree line with focused attention. Mason had made the call to continue. He had made the right call with the information he had. What he hadn't known, what no one had known, was that somewhere in the chaos of the descent, in the darkness and the scramble of moving 12 people and 4 compromised personnel down a mountain at 3 a.m, a fragment had entered Atlas's body, and Atlas had simply decided not to show it. The thing was, fragments from EEDs or enemy small arms during an engagement were one explanation. But the IED on Route Sabre had detonated before they were anywhere near it. It had hit the intel team's vehicle hours earlier, and there had been no direct enemy contact during the recovery element's movement, which meant the fragment had come from somewhere else. Mason spent 40 minutes with Atlas in the ICU once they moved him out of recovery. The dog was sedated but responsive at the edges, his ear tracking Mason's voice, his breathing slow and regular in a way it hadn't been in days. The surgical site was dressed cleanly. The cardiac monitor showed a rhythm that Evelyn, stopping by at 10:45, described as encouraging. He's going to need at least 3 weeks of restricted movement, she said. After that, controlled exercise. His recovery potential is actually quite good given his baseline conditioning. Will he work again? She considered the question with more honesty than he'd expected. It's possible, but that would be a decision made months from now, not weeks. She paused. Captain, whatever he was before, he's earned the right to be something else, if that's what the recovery allows. Mason looked at Atlas, at the chest rising and falling, at the gray coming in around his muzzle that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Yeah, he said quietly. He has. He stayed another 20 minutes, talking in a low voice about nothing important. A patch of land he'd looked at near the coast, the particular way Atlas used to lose his mind over the smell of the river at the edge of the training facility, the time in Germany when Atlas had eaten an entire unattended bratwurst off a food cart and then acted completely indifferent to the accusation. Small things, real things. Then he got up, squared his uniform, and went to find out who had shot his dog. Warrant Officer. First Class Daniel Kowalski ran the Forensic and Technical Support Cell out of a converted supply room in Building 14 that smelled permanently of soldering flux and printer toner. He was 32 years old, built like someone who had been assembled with efficiency rather than aesthetics in mind, and he had the particular social energy of a person who found objects significantly more reliable than people. He also happened to be one of the 3 best ballistic analysis technicians currently serving in the Army's Special Operations Support Structure, a fact he was too indifferent to his own reputation to mention to anyone. Mason found him eating a breakfast sandwich over a spectrometer display at 11:15. Kowalski looked at the specimen container Mason set on his desk. He looked at Mason. Briggs said, "Off book," Kowalski said. "That's right. That's not really how off book works when you show up at my desk in person with a sample. The sample stays with you. No chain of custody documentation until I decide what to do with it." Mason sat down in the one other chair in the room, an office chair with a broken armrest that had been duct taped and rebroken at least twice. "I need a materials analysis and a ballistic profile. Weapon type, caliber estimation if possible, and any manufacturing signatures." Kowalski picked up the container, tilted it in the light the way Mason had done in the hallway, and studied the fragment through the clear plastic. "This is a flechette," he said. It wasn't a question. Mason went still. "You can tell that from looking at it?" "I can tell that from the profile and the deformation pattern on the leading edge." Kowalski set the container down. "Standard rifle rounds fragment differently. Flechettes are subcaliber penetrators. They're fin-stabilized, dense, and they punch through in a straight line before tumbling in tissue." He tapped the container lightly. "This tumbled, and the core material looks like it's tungsten steel composite, not lead or copper jacketing." "What platforms fire that?" "Flechette rounds aren't common. Some experimental munitions programs, specialized close-range penetration applications." He paused. "And certain integrated defense contractors' proprietary ammunition lines, the ones that supply non-standard small arms packages to security and intelligence operations." The room was quiet for a moment. "So, not enemy ordnance," Mason said. "Not standard enemy ordnance." Kowalski's eyes were neutral and precise. "Could be captured or traded material. But the manufacturing signature on this, the composite profile, that's Western produced. I'd need to run the full analysis to be certain, but my first look is telling me this didn't come off a mountain pass in Norhaven, not from the other side of the fight." Mason looked at the container. "How long for the full analysis?" 6 hours if I move other things." "Move them." Kowalski picked up his breakfast sandwich and took another bite, unrattled. "You understand that if this goes where you think it's going, off-book stops being an option at some point." "I understand that." "And you're okay with where that leads?" Mason stood up. "Run the analysis, Kowalski." The warrant officer nodded and reached for his gloves. But then, Mason's next problem was Grant Voss. Voss was a staff sergeant, rear security specialist, and had been with the unit for 3 years. He was the kind of soldier who excelled at the visible parts of being a soldier. His uniform was always right, his paperwork was always filed. He hit his qualification scores cleanly and without complaint. In formation, he looked like exactly what the Army wanted him to look like. Mason had never entirely trusted him, and for a long time he hadn't had a reason for that beyond instinct, which wasn't a reason he could put in writing. Voss was physically large, broad through the shoulders, with a way of occupying space in a room that some people read as confidence and others read as deliberate displacement. He was social in a calculated way, always present at the right moments, always with the right word available. He knew how people worked, and he used that knowledge with a fluency that made Mason, watching from a distance, faintly uncomfortable. The unit respected him. A few of the younger soldiers genuinely liked him. Mason's instinct wasn't proof of anything, but Atlas had been behind their own line of advance. He'd been between Mason and the rear element, and Voss had been running rear security. Mason found him in the motor pool at 1300, doing something unnecessary to the vehicle he'd been assigned on Norhaven, cleaning a windshield that was already clean, the kind of busy work that people do when they need to be somewhere visible and purposeful looking. Mason walked up without announcing himself. Voss turned, registered him, and his expression did a small complex thing, a fraction of a second of something before it settled into professional acknowledgement. "Captain, heard Atlas made it through surgery. Good news." "It is." Mason stopped at a distance that was conversational but not casual. "What are you working on?" Voss glanced at the windshield. "Pre-op check. Next training cycle starts Thursday." "Right. Mason looked at the vehicle for a moment. I've been going back over the Norhaven movement, going through every element's positioning on the withdrawal. Voss's hand, still holding the squeegee, didn't move. Find anything useful? Working on it. Mason looked back at him. When Atlas stumbled at the 2-kilometer mark, your rear element was how far back? Standard spacing, 20-25 meters? Did you hear anything? Any sound that didn't fit the environment? Voss thought about it, or performed thinking about it, which is a different thing. Wind was up, hard to parse anything directional. He shrugged slightly. I noted the halt when it came over the net. Assumed terrain issue with the dog. Right. Mason held his eyes for one more second. Appreciate it. He walked away without waiting for a response. Behind him, he didn't hear Voss move for at least 10 seconds. Sig. Briggs caught up with him outside the motor pool at 13:20. Voss saw you come out of building 14, Briggs said, falling into step. Mason kept walking. How do you know that? Because Lynn was in the parking lot doing PT and watched Voss watch you. Then Voss went inside for about 15 minutes and came back out looking like he'd just done math he didn't like the answer to. When? About 45 minutes ago. Mason ran the timeline. Kowalski had his sample. The analysis was running. If Voss suspected something was in motion. Is Kowalski's workspace accessible from the network? Mason asked. His analysis systems are standalone, air-gapped from the main unit network. That's why he runs forensics out of that room instead of the main lab. Mason exhaled. Okay? Okay like we're fine, or okay like you're thinking. Okay like I need 48 hours and I don't know if I have them. Briggs was quiet for a moment. They walked past the edge of the motor pool onto the path that ran alongside the administrative block. The afternoon had gone gray and close, the kind of sky that couldn't decide between rain and overcast. You know what you're accusing him of, Briggs said. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement that deserved to be said out loud. I know. That's not a thing you walk back from. If you're wrong, if I'm wrong, Kowalski runs an analysis on a fragment that doesn't match anything on our equipment list and I deal with the paperwork. And if you're right? Mason didn't answer immediately. They kept walking. A transport vehicle rolled past them headed toward the maintenance bay, engine loud enough to cover conversation. If I'm right, Mason said eventually, then during a personnel recovery mission in the Varkan Valley, a member of our unit fired a weapon in the direction of our own element. Atlas walked into it, and whatever Voss was trying to accomplish in that moment, whether it was panic or something deliberate, a fragment of that round has been sitting inside a working dog's chest for 17 days while that dog kept doing his job. The transport cleared the road. The noise died. I'm not walking back from that either way, Mason said. What? He went back to the clinic at 1800. Atlas was more alert. Still restricted, still on monitoring, but his eyes were tracking normally, and his head lifted when Mason came through the door. A small movement, careful, the surgical site still tender, but his ears were up and his gaze was clear. Mason sat beside him, put his hand on the dog's neck. Kowalski's working on it, he said quietly. Hale says you're stable. Evelyn says your heart looks better than it has in 2 weeks, which makes sense because 2 weeks ago, something was trying to wreck it from the inside. He scratched gently behind Atlas's ear. You should have told me. I know that's not how you work, but you should have told me. Atlas put his chin on the edge of the padded rail and looked at him. I know. Mason shook his head. You don't do that. You're not built that way. He sat there until the lights in the corridor shifted from afternoon bright to evening dim. A night tech stopped by at 1900, adjusted Atlas's IV rate, checked the dressing, made a note. She moved quietly around Mason like he was part of the furniture and didn't ask him to leave. He was still there at 2100 when his phone vibrated. A text from Kowalski. No message. Just a single character. A question mark. That was Kowalski's code for, come to my office, don't text back. Mason stood up slowly. He looked at Atlas for a moment. I'll be back, he said. He walked out into the corridor, turned toward Building 14, and the quiet of the clinic followed him only as far as the door. Kowalski was at his desk with 3 screens open and the overhead light off, working entirely by monitor glow and a single desk lamp. He looked up when Mason came in, and his expression was the particular flatness of someone who had hoped to find a different answer and hadn't. He slid a printed report across the desk without preamble. Mason picked it up. The top sheet was a material composition analysis. Tungsten steel composite, 91% confidence match to a proprietary manufacturing signature. Below it, a ballistic profile comparison. Below that, a one-paragraph summary that Kowalski had written in the dry, careful language of someone who knew this document might eventually be evidence. Mason read to the bottom of the page. The fragment was consistent with flechette ammunition produced under a defense contractor manufacturing contract. That contract supplied a limited number of authorized units. The signature matched rounds used in a specific class of close-quarters suppression weapon, not standard infantry issue. The unit on the authorized supply list included their own element. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in Kowalski's small, precise script, was a single addition. Weapon, PDW class, suppressed. Effective range at fragment recovery site, 18 to 30 meters. Rear security spacing on Norhaven withdrawal, 20 to 25 meters. Mason set the paper down on the desk. The numbers fit like a key in a lock. Kowalski leaned back in his chair. "Off bookends here," he said. "Whatever you do next, this report exists. I'm the one who ran it. That's not something I can undo." "I'm not asking you to." "I know." Kowalski looked at the screens. "I just need you to understand that I did the analysis and I'm standing behind it. Whatever comes from it." Well, Mason picked up the report, looked at the numbers one more time. The range, the spacing, the composite signature. 20 to 25 meters behind Mason's position. A suppressed weapon. A flechette round. One brief controlled moment in the darkness of a mountain withdrawal when the noise and confusion of moving 14 people down a ridge in the middle of the night would have covered almost anything. Almost. "Voss," Mason said. It wasn't a question anymore. Kowalski didn't answer, because there was nothing left to answer. Mason folded the report, put it in his breast pocket beside where the specimen container had been, and walked out of Building 14 into the cold Virginia night, with his hand steady and his mind running fast and clean, already calculating what came next. Ong mo rung noizung. Show more. The night air outside Building 14 was cold enough to sting, and Mason stood in it for a full minute before he moved. The report was in his pocket. The analysis was clean. The numbers were not ambiguous. The problem was what came next. In a different world, a simpler one, he would have walked this directly to his commanding officer, Colonel Dennis Hartwell, laid the report on his desk, and let the institutional machinery do what it was built to do. That was the process. That was the chain. But Voss had been running rear security on Norhaven, and Norhaven had been a mission that exactly 4 people in the unit had known the full route and timeline for before insertion. Hartwell was one of them. Mason was another. The intelligence officer, Captain Reyes, was the third. Voss was the fourth. That wasn't an accusation. That was geometry. Mason walked back toward the barracks block with his hands in his jacket pockets and his mind running the angles. If Voss had been feeding information to someone outside the unit, and the flechette round, the suppressed PDW, the specific moment of opportunity during the withdrawal suggested this was not a panic shot, but a calculated one, then someone had told Voss what to do and when. Which meant someone outside this building knew enough about their operations to give those instructions. Which meant Mason needed to know who Voss had been talking to before he handed this to anyone inside the unit who might already be part of it. He pulled out his phone and called a number he hadn't used in 14 months. It rang 4 times. "Reed." The voice on the other end was female, flat, and did not sound like someone who had been asleep. "It's past 2100. "I know what time it is, Carver." Special Agent Dana Carver, NCIS, had worked a procurement fraud case that briefly intersected with Mason's unit the previous year. She was methodical, unsentimental, and had the particular quality of someone who treated information like currency. She didn't spend it carelessly. Mason had respected her for that. "I have a forensic analysis that I need walked to the right place without going through my unit chain first," he said. "I have reasons for that." A pause. What kind of analysis? Ballistic materials. A fragment pulled from a working dog during surgery this morning. The profile matches proprietary ammunition on our own authorized supply list. Another pause, longer this time. You're saying one of yours, Carver said. I'm saying the numbers point that way. I'm not saying anything beyond the numbers until someone qualified looks at them. Reed, I'm not asking you to open an investigation tonight. I'm asking you to tell me who I hand this to so it doesn't disappear. The line was quiet long enough that he could hear her exhale. Come to my office at 0800, she said. Bring the analysis and the original sample. Don't talk to anyone in your chain between now and then. Understood. And Reed, if this is what it sounds like, you need to be careful about how visible you are between now and 0800. He looked around at the empty path, the yellow-lit windows of the barracks, the quiet of the base at night. Already thinking about it, he ended the call and kept walking. He didn't sleep. He went back to the clinic at 2200 and sat with Atlas until midnight, because it was the one place he could think clearly and the one place that felt, for lack of a better word, stable. Atlas was more awake by then, not fully, not comfortable, but oriented. He lifted his head when Mason came in. His tail moved twice. Mason sat in the chair beside the table and did not talk this time. He just stayed. At one point, around 2300, Evelyn Cross came through on her late check and found him there. She looked at Atlas, looked at the monitors, made a note on her tablet. "You're still here," she said. Apparently, she didn't suggest he leave. She updated the chart and walked out. Mason looked at Atlas, at the way the dog slept in short intervals and then surfaced briefly, checking the room, checking Mason, then settling again. Even medicated, even post-surgical, the behavior was intact. The instinct to be aware, to confirm the environment, to verify that the person he was responsible for was present and accounted for. He was still doing his job. It made something in Mason's chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with clarity. He left the clinic at 0100, went back to his quarters, lay on his bed without taking off his uniform, and stared at the ceiling until 5:30. Then he got up, showered, put on fresh clothes, and went to find Briggs. Briggs was in the team room running his morning comms check, which was routine and gave him a reason to be in the building early without it registering as unusual. Mason found him there at 0545 with the room to themselves. He told him about Carver. He didn't ask for an opinion. Briggs listened to the whole thing, then set down the handset he'd been holding and said, "Does Voss know you've been to Kowalski?" "He suspects something. He doesn't know what. If he starts moving files or communications before Carver can get a look." "I know. Is there anything on the unit network that would give him a signal that the analysis is done?" Mason shook his head. "Kowalski runs standalone, but Voss has been here 3 years. He knows Kowalski's work. If he thinks a ballistic analysis is running, he'll know the timeline." Briggs picked up the handset again and set it back down. It was the kind of gesture a person made when they needed something to do with their hands. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to keep eyes on Voss this morning, not close, peripheral. I need to know if he goes anywhere that isn't routine before I get back at 0900. And if he does?" "Call me. Don't engage." Briggs looked at him steadily. "And if he moves to do something that's not just going somewhere?" Mason held his gaze. "Then you use your judgment and call me first." It wasn't a clean answer, and both of them knew it, but it was an honest one. Carver's NCIS field office was 22 minutes from the base. Mason made it in 17. She was already at her desk when he was shown in, with a second coffee on the corner of the desk that turned out to be for him. He took it without being asked. He laid the report on her desk, laid the specimen container beside it. She read the report without speaking, with the focused, expressionless attention of someone who had learned to keep their face out of the process. She read it twice. Then she picked up the specimen container, examined it, set it down. "Kowalski," she said. "He runs forensics for the unit, standalone systems, air-gapped from the main network. His methodology is solid? He's the best in the building. Ask anyone who knows the technical side." Carver looked at the range notation at the bottom of the page, at the spacing calculation. 18 to 30 meters, rear security. Standard spacing was 20 to 25. She leaned back in her chair. Staff Sergeant Grant Voss. That's where the geometry points. Does he know you've got this? He knows I've been asking questions. He doesn't know about Kowalski's analysis, but he's smart enough to be nervous. Carver tapped the desk once with her index finger. A single, decisive movement. I'm going to need to move on this quickly. If he starts clearing communication records, can you access those without tipping the chain? I have a parallel authorization for communications monitoring on active personnel with security clearances under a standing counterintelligence review. She said it without inflection, as if she were reading off a catalog. It doesn't require me to notify your unit command to initiate. Good. But Reed, when this moves, it moves fast and it moves officially. You understand that whatever informal groundwork you've laid is going to be part of the record. I know. Including why you went off book with the analysis. I went off book because I didn't know how far up the information problem went. He met her eyes. That's the truth. She studied him for a moment. 4 people had the full Norhaven route and timeline. Yes. And you're one of them. Yes. She let that sit for a second, not to be cruel, but because it needed to be acknowledged. I'm going to need you available and reachable all day. If I pull communication records and they show what your ballistic analysis suggests, we'll need to move by tonight at the latest. I understand. Go back to your base. Act normal. Don't approach Voss. Mason stood up and picked up his coffee. How normal does normal need to look? Normal enough that if he's watching you, he doesn't see someone who spent the morning at an NCIS office. He put on his jacket. I can do that. He was almost at the door when Carver spoke again. Reed? He stopped. The dog going to be okay? He looked back at her. Yeah, he said. He is. She nodded once and turned back to her computer. I'm out. He got back to base at 0912. Briggs was waiting for him near the vehicle drop-off, with his hands in his pockets, and an expression that was not the expression of someone whose morning had been uneventful. Mason slowed as he approached. What? Voss went to the armory at 0815, signed out a cleaning kit for his PDW. Briggs's voice was completely neutral. Brought it back at 0902. The PDW. The same class of weapon Kowalski's analysis flagged. He's cleaning it, Mason said. Looks like. That's legal. Completely. Briggs paused. He also made a phone call at 0840 from the parking lot outside the armory. Personal cell, not the unit line. 8 minutes. Mason absorbed this. To who? I don't have that. I just saw him on the phone. The timing was tight. Voss signs out the weapon for cleaning, makes a long personal call from a location where he's harder to overhear, returns the kit. All of it individually unremarkable. All of it, in sequence, looking like a man covering ground. Mason pulled out his phone and texted Carver a single line. He cleaned his PDW this morning and made an 8-minute personal call on his cell at 0840. The reply came back in under 2 minutes. Noted. Communications pool is running. Stay put. He put the phone away. Carver's moving, he told Briggs. Briggs exhaled through his nose. How long? She said by tonight. And until then? We act normal. Briggs looked across the parking lot toward the motor pool. Voss has duty section this afternoon. He'll be in and around the vehicles until 1700. Good. That keeps him visible. Mason. Briggs's voice dropped. If he figures out that the NCIS is pulling his communications today, he won't panic, Mason said. He's not that kind of person. He'll calculate. He looked in the same direction Briggs was looking. That's actually what worries me more. The afternoon was the longest Mason could remember that didn't involve active combat. He sat through a routine operations planning meeting at 1100 that he would not later be able to recount in any detail. He signed off on a training schedule. He answered 3 emails. He went back to the clinic at 1400 and found Atlas sitting up for the first time, accepting water from a small bowl, blinking with the slow deliberateness of an animal that is in pain but managing it. There you are, Mason said. Atlas looked at him. His tail moved. Mason sat on the stool and watched him drink and thought about nothing useful for 20 minutes. It was the most peaceful 20 minutes of the day. He was back in his office at 1500 when Carver called. "I have his communications," she said. 12 days of records. "Reed, this is bigger than a single bad shot." He sat down. "Tell me." 23 separate calls to a number registered to a logistics contractor based in the Whitmore Commercial District. The contractor has 3 clients, 2 legitimate freight operations, and 1 entity we've been watching for 14 months under a separate financial crimes investigation. She paused. The entity is connected to a criminal network that specializes in selling intelligence on military extraction routes to parties who have reason to want those routes disrupted. The room felt very quiet. "They knew we were going into Norhaven," Mason said. "They knew your route, your timeline, your personnel count, and your objective grid." Her voice was flat and precise. "The IED that hit the intelligence team's vehicle en route Sabre before you even inserted, the one that triggered the extraction mission, was not a random placement." Mason set his pen down on the desk very carefully. The IED had not been random. They had sent people into that mountain in the middle of the night to recover a team that had been stranded by an attack that was designed to strand them, to create a rescue mission, to put Mason's element on that ridge at that hour, in that darkness. "It was a setup," he said. "The entire operation was manufactured to put your unit in a specific location at a specific time." Carver's voice didn't modulate. Voss's function wasn't just to take a shot at the objective. He was the inside component of a larger operation. The attack on the intel team, the rescue mission, the route, all of it was designed to create a moment where something could happen and get covered by the operational chaos. They wanted someone on our element taken out. Based on Voss's call records and the timing of each contact, yes, and based on where Atlas was positioned relative to you when the round was fired. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Atlas had been between Mason and the rear of the element. The round had entered Atlas's right side, tracking at an angle consistent with a shot from behind and to the right, at a range of 22 meters, from a suppressed weapon. Someone had paid for Mason Reed to not come off that mountain. Atlas had walked into it. "I'm moving tonight," Carver said. "I need you to stay away from Voss. We'll pick him up through our own approach. I don't want you anywhere near this when it happens." "Understood." "Reed." "Yeah." "I'm sorry about the dog." She said it simply, no performance around it. "What he did on that mountain, whatever the case file says about it later, that matters." Mason didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll tell him you said so," he said. He ended the call, put his phone face down on the desk, sat in the silence of his office with his hands flat on the desk surface and the afternoon light coming through the blinds in thin, even lines across everything. Someone had built an entire operation around getting him killed, and a 67-pound dog with a piece of tungsten in his chest had quietly, methodically, without complaint or credit, made that operation fail. At 1847, Mason was in the clinic with Atlas when his phone buzzed with a text from Briggs that was 3 words long. They got him. Mason read it twice, put the phone in his pocket. Atlas had his chin on his paws and was watching Mason with the alert level attention that was his default state, present, steady, taking in information without broadcasting reaction. His breathing was easy. His ears were relaxed. "It's over," Mason said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a statement of fact, offered to the one other person in the room who had earned the right to hear it first. Atlas blinked slowly. Mason leaned forward and put his forehead down against the dog's head. They stayed like that for a long time, in a quiet room, in a clinic in Virginia, while somewhere across the base a military career and a criminal operation unraveled simultaneously, and none of it touched them here. Outside, a light rain started again against the windows. This time it didn't sound like static. This time it just sounded like rain. The rain against the clinic windows lasted another hour before it quit. Mason stayed through it. He sat beside Atlas and listened to it taper from steady to intermittent to nothing. And when it was done, the night outside was very still. Atlas slept in the particular way he always slept. Not deeply, not completely, one ear moving every few minutes to process the ambient sounds and file them away as non-threatening. Even recovering from surgery, even on pain management that would have put a person completely under, the dog's nervous system kept doing its job. Mason watched him and felt something settle in his chest. Not relief exactly, something quieter than that. The kind of feeling that comes after a long time of carrying a weight that is finally, partially, set down. His phone had been quiet since Briggs's text. That wouldn't last. It lasted until 2217, when his phone rang with a number he recognized as the base duty officer's line. He stepped into the corridor to take it. "Captain Reed." The voice was clipped and professional and gave nothing away. "Colonel Hartwell requests your presence at 0700 tomorrow, his office." "Confirmed," Mason said. He went back in, checked Atlas one more time, told the night tech he'd be in at 0600, and went back to his quarters to get 4 hours of sleep that turned out to be closer to 3 At 0638, Briggs found him outside the administrative building with a coffee he'd brought from the team room. "Do you know what he knows?" Mason asked. Carver briefed the installation commander at 2200 last night. Word came down to Hartwell through official channels at 0100. Briggs handed over the coffee. "He's been in his office since 0530. Who else is in there?" "His JAG rep. And someone from the counterintelligence directorate I don't recognize. Civilian, 30s, drove in from outside the base." Mason drank the coffee. It was bad coffee, the way coffee from the team room always was. Too strong and slightly burnt. And it was exactly what he needed. "How's Voss?" "In custody at the NCIS field office. His quarters were searched at 2100 last night. They pulled a phone, a laptop, and what Carver described to the duty officer as documentary material." Briggs paused. "His PDW was logged in the armory from this morning. Clean. Whatever he ran through it, he was thorough. Kowalski's fragment analysis doesn't need the weapon to still be dirty." "No," Briggs said. "It doesn't." A transport vehicle moved past the end of the path. 2 soldiers on the morning PT route ran by without looking at them. The base was doing what bases do, absorbing the overnight and moving into the day as if nothing had cracked open in the dark. "How are you?" Briggs said. Mason looked at him. It was a question Briggs almost never asked directly, which was why it landed the way it did. "Ask me after Hartwell," Mason said. Colonel Dennis Hartwell was 53 years old, lean in the way of someone who had maintained their physical standards not out of enjoyment, but out of the conviction that letting them slip was a form of dishonesty. He had a face that defaulted to assessment, always reading, always calculating, not unfriendly, but never quite warm. He had commanded this unit for 2 years and had a reputation for being someone you wanted on your side and very much did not want positioned against you. When Mason came through the door at 0659, Hartwell was at his desk. The JAG representative, a major named Ellison, sat against the left wall with a notepad open. The counterintelligence civilian, whose name Mason wasn't given, sat to the right of the desk in a chair that had been placed at a slight angle, so close enough to participate, far enough to observe. "Captain Reed." Hartwell didn't stand. He gestured at the chair across from his desk. "Sit down." Mason sat. "Walk me through it from the beginning," Hartwell said, "starting from when you first suspected something was wrong." It wasn't the opening Mason had expected. He'd prepared for a different version of this conversation, more institutional, more defensive, more structured around the fact that he'd run an off-book forensic analysis without notifying his chain of command. Instead, Hartwell looked like a man who wanted information, not a man looking to establish fault. Mason walked him through it. The imaging results. Kowalski. The ballistic profile. The range and spacing calculation. The call to Carver. He kept it sequential and factual and didn't editorialize. Hartwell listened without interrupting. The CI civilian made occasional notes. Ellison kept his pen still and his face neutral. When Mason finished, Hartwell was quiet for about 10 seconds. "Why didn't you come to me with Kowalski's analysis?" he said. There it was. Because 4 people had the full Norhaven route and timeline before insertion, Mason said. I didn't know how far the information problem went. I needed the analysis to be clean before I handed it anywhere. Hartwell's expression didn't change. You're including me in that. I'm including everyone, sir, including myself. He held Hartwell's eyes. That's not an accusation. That's a methodology. The room was very quiet. If I were in your position, Hartwell said slowly, I'd probably have done the same thing. He leaned back in his chair. I want that noted for the record. Ellison wrote something. The communications poll that Carver ran, Hartwell continued, shows 23 contacts over 12 days to a number connected to a criminal intelligence network. He picked up a sheet from his desk. The entity they've been watching has been identified as a brokerage operation. They collect military operational data and sell it to clients who have financial interests in disrupting specific extraction corridors. Contractors, mostly. People whose operations become more profitable when certain routes become unsafe. The IED on Route Sabre, Mason said, was placed by a local cell on contracted instruction, Hartwell confirmed. The intent was to strand the intelligence team and trigger a recovery operation. Our unit was the recovery asset assigned to that sector. The operation was designed with knowledge of our deployment rotation. He set the sheet down. Voss has been in contact with this network for approximately 7 months. The Norhaven mission wasn't the first time he passed information. It was the first time he was asked to do more than pass it. 7 months. Mason looked at a point on the wall for a moment. 7 months of duty cycles, briefings, planning sessions. 7 months of eating at the same table and running PT on the same track. The shot on the withdrawal, Mason said. His instructions were to create a terminal incident that could be attributed to the operational environment. Darkness, stress, enemy threat. The kind of thing that generates an incident report, not an investigation. Hartwell's voice was flat and deliberate. He fired once, suppressed, during the movement. The fragment entered Atlas's body at an angle consistent with Voss's position in the formation. The room absorbed that for a moment. Atlas was between you and Voss when it happened, Hartwell said. Yes, sir. The round was meant for you. Yes, sir. Hartwell looked at him for a long moment. The CI civilian had stopped writing. Even Ellison had gone still. The unit is going to need time to process this, Hartwell said finally. There will be a formal investigation. NCIS leads it, counterintelligence supports. Everyone in the unit will be interviewed. Some of those interviews are going to be uncomfortable. Understood. Kowalski's analysis will become part of the official evidentiary record. He understood that when he ran it. He told me himself. He said he was standing behind it. Something in Hartwell's face moved. Not much, but enough. Good man, he said quietly. He stood up. Mason stood automatically. The investigation into Voss's external contacts is going to take time, Hartwell said. The network he was working with, we need to identify all the clients, all the operations they potentially had visibility into. He looked at Mason steadily. This isn't over today. You understand that? Yes, sir. You're going to be interviewed multiple times. Your personal movements over the last 72 hours are going to be part of the record. Going off book with the analysis, going to Carver before coming to me. Those decisions are going to be documented and reviewed. I know. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You made the right calls with incomplete information under circumstances where making the wrong call would have buried this. He said it without warmth, but without reservation. That's what the record is going to show. I'm not worried about the record, Mason said. I know you're not. Hartwell extended his hand. How's the dog? Mason shook it. Sitting up and drinking water on his own as of last night. For the first time in the conversation, something in Hartwell's face softened. Briefly, genuinely, and then it was gone. Good, he said. Dismissed. Keep welcome. The formal interview with the NCIS team happened that afternoon in a conference room on the far side of the administrative building. Carver was there, along with a senior agent named Price, who had the energy of someone who had sat through many of these and intended to sit through many more. 2 counterintelligence officers attended as observers. It lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Mason told the same story he had told Hartwell, but with more granularity, timestamps, exact words from conversations, the specific sequence of observations that had moved him from unease to investigation. Carver asked most of the questions. She was precise and impersonal in a way that Mason recognized as professional respect. She wasn't soft-pedaling because she knew him, and she wasn't harder on him because of it either. At one point, Price leaned forward and said, "Captain Reed, when you contacted Special Agent Carver at 2112 the night before last, did you have any concern that going outside your chain of command could compromise the investigation?" "I went outside my chain specifically because I didn't yet know the scope of the compromise," Mason said. "Going through a potentially contaminated channel to investigate a contamination problem would have been tactically unsound." Price wrote something down. "And the decision to have Kowalski run the analysis off book?" "Same reasoning. I needed a clean result before I knew who to hand it to. Kowalski's standalone systems gave me that. He understood the implications from the first conversation." Price looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone testing the tensile strength of an answer. Then he moved on. By the end of the 3rd hour, the questions had become more granular in a way that told Mason they were filling in gaps rather than looking for problems. That was fine. He could live with granular. When they let him out at 1743, the light outside had gone orange and long. He stood on the steps of the building and let the afternoon air hit his face and did not think about anything for approximately 90 seconds. Then he went to the clinic. Atlas was standing. Not for long. The tech told Mason he'd been up twice, briefly, walking a few steps with careful, deliberate movements before lying back down. But standing was standing. 3 days after they'd pulled a fragment from the tissue around his heart and fought him back from a stopped cardiac event, the dog was standing. He was lying down again when Mason came in, but his head was fully up and his ears were forward, and he made a sound in the back of his throat. Not quite a bark, not a whine, something between greeting and complaint, when Mason appeared in the doorway. "I know," Mason said. "I was gone too long." He sat down. Atlas put his head on Mason's knee, which was new. He hadn't been able to do that from the table position before. The fact that he was reaching for it now meant his range of motion was returning. Mason put his hand on the dog's head and sat there. After a while, Evelyn came in for the evening check. She reviewed the chart, checked the surgical dressing, assessed the monitor readings with the focused attention of someone who had been recalibrating her expectations upward all day. "His recovery rate is faster than I projected," she said. It came out sounding faintly reproachful, the way good news sometimes does when it disrupts a careful prognosis. "His cardiovascular readings this afternoon were better than what I was hoping for at day 5. "He's motivated," Mason said. She looked at Atlas, who was still resting his head on Mason's knee. "Apparently." She made a note. "I want to keep him another week minimum, but I'm revising my estimate on the restricted activity timeline. He's strong, Captain. Whatever he did to manage that injury during the mission, the controlled movement, the even distribution, it actually limited the progression. A different animal might have made it worse faster by moving wrong." "He's careful," Mason said. "He is." She capped her pen. "Has anyone in the military system started a formal record of what he did? The mission continuation under an undisclosed injury, the ballistic event? Is any of that being documented as part of his service record?" "I'll make sure it is," Mason said. She nodded and walked out. Mason looked down at Atlas. "You hear that? People are writing things down about you." Atlas shifted his weight slightly, resettling his head. "You never cared about that," Mason said. "I know." Heat. The debrief with Hartwell and 2 officers from the Counterintelligence Directorate happened the following morning. This time in a secure conference room in the operations building with the door locked and phones collected at the entrance. The focus had shifted from Mason's actions to the scope of what Voss had passed. The picture that emerged over 2 hours was methodical and grim. Voss had made first contact with the network approximately 8 months ago through a connection that the CI team was still tracing, a financial relationship that had begun as what appeared to be an investment arrangement and had evolved into a paid intelligence relationship. He had passed 7 sets of operational information before Norhaven. 2 of those missions had experienced significant complications, an unexpected contact in the Kellner district 3 months ago that had cost them a vehicle and 2 minor injuries, and a surveillance operation in the Crest corridor that had been compromised before it started. At the time, both incidents had been attributed to local intelligence failures, or bad luck. "We lost people on Kellner," said one of the CI officers, a captain named Ferris. "Not killed, but one of those injuries was significant. Sergeant Alvarez, shrapnel to the left hand. He's been doing physical therapy for 2 months. Mason looked at the table. Based on the communications record, Voss had passed the Kellner route 3 days before, Ferris continued. We can't prove causation conclusively, but the timeline is consistent. The room processed that. Alvarez doesn't know, Mason said. Not yet. Ferris looked at him. That conversation will happen through the appropriate channels when the investigation is at a stage where it can be disclosed. He deserves to know sooner than later. I agree with you, Ferris said. That doesn't change the timeline. Mason kept his expression in place. The institutional answer was the right answer in terms of process, and it sat in his chest like something undigested. The second hour was focused on the network itself, the CI team's existing investigation, the 14-month surveillance operation that Voss's arrest had now intersected with, the question of whether any other active duty personnel had been recruited into the same relationship. Carver attended this portion remotely by secure line and provided 3 minutes of crisp, organized summary that told Mason she had been up since early and had done more work in the last 18 hours than most people managed in a week. At the end of the session, Hartwell looked around the table. This unit's operational integrity has been compromised at an unknown level for approximately 8 months. We are treating every mission that occurred in that window as potentially exposed until the full scope of Voss's disclosures is mapped. He paused. That is going to affect our upcoming operational calendar. It is going to require internal reviews that some people in this unit will find uncomfortable and invasive. We do it anyway. He looked at Mason last. Read, the analysis you ran, the chain of reasoning from the imaging results to the ballistic profile to the NCIS contact, is the reason we're sitting in this room today and not in a debrief 3 months from now trying to figure out why another operation went wrong. He said it without ceremony. I want that in the record. Kowalski ran the analysis, Mason said, and you brought him the sample and knew what to do with the results. Hartwell's voice was flat and even. Don't redistribute the credit. It doesn't fit you. Mason didn't have an answer for that. He nodded once. Hartwell adjourned the meeting. 3 days later, Mason walked into Atlas's room at the clinic and found the dog on his feet, standing on the padded floor beside the examination table, tail moving at a controlled and deliberate pace. The tech was 2 steps away with a steadying hand near but not touching. Atlas looked at Mason and his whole posture changed. The particular shift of weight and attention and orientation that a dog makes when the person they have been waiting for finally walks through a door. Mason crouched down to his level. Hey, he said. Atlas walked to him. 4 steps, careful and a little stiff on the right side, but continuous and certain. He put his muzzle against Mason's jaw and held it there. The tech made a note on the chart and quietly gave them the room. Mason stayed crouched, one hand on Atlas's neck, feeling the dog's breathing under his palm, deep and steady, nothing laboring, the irregular catch of 2 weeks ago completely gone. They're talking about a commendation, Mason said. Formal recognition. Hartwell put it in motion yesterday. He stroked the dog's neck. You'll hate the ceremony. There will be a crowd and you'll spend the whole time watching the perimeter instead of paying attention to the part where they're talking about you. Atlas stayed pressed against him. That's fine, Mason said. I'll pay attention for both of us. He stood up slowly. Atlas stayed close, adjusting his position as Mason moved, keeping contact. Outside the clinic window, the afternoon was clear for the first time in a week, blue and clean, the kind of light that made everything look a little more distinct than usual, edges sharper, shadows longer and more defined. Mason looked at it and thought about the coast, about a property listing he'd bookmarked 6 months ago and never done anything with, about what it would look like to not be on a deployment rotation, About what Atlas looked like right now, standing in afternoon light, 3 days past a surgery that had been 60-40, tail still moving. About what loyalty cost and what it built, and how sometimes the two things were the exact same transaction. He looked down at his partner. "One more week in here," he said. "Then we figure out what comes next." Atlas looked up at him with the clear, amber, completely present attention that had been looking back at Mason across 8 years of everything that had happened between them. The tail moved again. Steady, certain. That was enough. The 1 more week turned into 9 days. Mason didn't complain about it. He came to the clinic every morning before 700 and every evening after whatever the day had required of him. And in between, he did the work that the investigation generated. Interviews, documentation reviews, operational security assessments, a 7-hour session with the counterintelligence team that covered the entirety of Voss's tenure in the unit, and emerged with a list of 23 missions that would need individual review. He signed things and answered questions and sat across conference tables from people who were doing their jobs carefully and thoroughly, and he did all of it with the particular patience of someone who had a fixed point to return to at the end of each day. Atlas was the fixed point. By day 6, Atlas was walking the length of the clinic corridor twice daily with Mason beside him. Slow, deliberate circuits that the surgical team monitored with careful attention to his gait and his breathing and the way he held his right side. The stiffness was there, but diminishing. He moved with the focused intentionality of an animal relearning its own body, testing each step before committing to it, recalibrating. On the 9th morning, Evelyn Cross met Mason at the door with his chart in hand and a look on her face that was the closest she got to visibly pleased. "His cardiovascular readings have been clean for 4 consecutive days," she said. "The surgical site has closed well. His gait assessment this morning showed no compensatory patterns." She handed him the chart. "He's ready to go home, Captain." Mason looked at the chart, at the clean rows of improving numbers, at the word discharge at the top of the morning's entry. "When?" "Today, if you want." He looked up. "I want." Sigh. He brought Atlas out through the clinic's side door at 1400 into an afternoon that was warm for the first time in weeks. Genuinely warm, not just less cold, the kind of day that felt like the season finally making a decision. Atlas walked through the door on his own, stopped on the concrete pad outside, and lifted his nose to the air. He stood there for a long moment, reading whatever the wind was carrying. His ears moved. His chest expanded with a slow, deep breath. Then his tail started moving. Not the controlled, careful movement of the last 9 days. This was the real thing. Broad, sweeping, his whole back end involved. He turned his head and looked at Mason with an expression that needed no translation. "Yeah," Mason said. "I know." He opened the rear door of the truck and Atlas jumped in. Not cleanly, not the fluid single-motion vault that had always been his default, but he made it, landing a little heavy on his right side and immediately correcting his balance. He turned around twice on the back seat and settled with his chin on the door armrest, nose pointed at the window crack. Mason got in the driver's seat. He sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel and the engine not yet started. 9 days ago, he had been sitting in a plastic chair in a hallway outside an ICU, watching a dog breathe wrong and waiting for a veterinarian to ask him to sign a piece of paper. The distance between that moment and this one was not long in time, but was extremely long in everything else. He started the engine. Atlas made a sound of deep satisfaction from the back seat. "Don't get too comfortable," Mason said. "We've still got the ceremony tomorrow." Atlas said nothing, which was Atlas's standard response to information he had decided was not operationally relevant to him. The formal recognition ceremony was held at 1000 hours on the parade ground of the installation, on a morning that was overcast but dry, the kind of sky that holds its weather without committing to it. The unit was in formation, all of them. Every soldier who wasn't on a medical profile or an essential duty assignment that couldn't be covered. 83 people in dress uniform, standing in 3 ranks in the cool morning air, plus the medical staff from Silver Harbor Clinic, who had been invited and had come in a group, Evelyn Cross and Victor Hale standing together at the edge of the formation, plus Kowalski, who stood slightly apart from his usual section with the specific posture of someone who found large gatherings of people gathering adjacent to personally inefficient, but was present because it mattered. Mason stood at the front, at ease, in his dress uniform. Atlas sat beside his left leg. Atlas was not wearing anything ceremonial because Atlas did not wear ceremonial things. He was clean, his coat recently brushed, his surgical scar hidden under fur that was already growing back over the site. He sat with the upright, forward-facing posture that was his natural state, ears forward, watching the assembled formation with the focused attention he gave to everything. Colonel Hartwell walked to the front of the formation at precisely 1,000. He was not a man who performed ceremony. He executed it, the same way he executed everything, with the minimum of flourish and the maximum of intention. He read the citation himself. It covered Atlas's 8 years of service. It covered the missions, the number of operations, the successful tracks, the personnel recoveries, the confirmed assists to unit safety that had been tallied and documented over the span of a career. It covered Norhaven, specifically and without euphemism. It described the ballistic event, the fragment, the 17 days of mission continuation under an injury that should have grounded him, and the way that injury had become the thread that unraveled a 7-month intelligence compromise. Hartwell read the last section without varying his tone, but the formation was absolutely still. Then he said, "For extraordinary valor in the continuation of duty under grievous undisclosed injury, and for the protection of personnel under direct threat at significant personal cost, Military Working Dog Atlas is hereby awarded the Meritorious Service Medal and is honorably retired from active service with full recognition of his contributions to this unit and this command." He closed the citation folder. The formation stayed still for 1 precise second. Then somebody in the second rank started clapping. Not the formal, ceremonial kind, but the real kind, irregular and immediate. And it spread through the ranks in about 3 seconds until 83 people were applauding in a way that was not regulation, and nobody moved to stop it. Atlas turned his head and looked at Mason. "That's for you," Mason said quietly. Atlas turned back to the formation. His tail moved twice. On. Hartwell came to Mason afterward, when the formation had broken and people were moving in the loose, relieved way of a large group that has finished something formal and is returning to being individuals. "The paperwork for his permanent companion status went through yesterday," Hartwell said. "He's yours, officially. Not that it was ever a question." "No," Mason said. "It wasn't." Hartwell looked at Atlas, who was currently accepting careful attention from 2 of the younger soldiers who had crouched down to his level, and who was tolerating this with the dignified patience of someone performing a public relations function that was not their first preference. "The Voss investigation," Hartwell said, "is going to produce charges on multiple counts. NCIS estimates the full case build takes 3 to 4 months. The network he was connected to, the CI team has expanded their existing investigation based on his communications. 3 other individuals of interest have been identified outside this unit." He paused. "It's going to be a long process." "I know." "You're going to be a witness." "I know that too." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "Are you putting in the paperwork?" Mason looked at him. "You read the chain of thought, sir." "I did." Hartwell's expression was unreadable in the way that meant he had read it and processed it and had an opinion he was choosing to hold. "I'm not going to tell you it's wrong. I'm going to tell you that you're one of the better officers I've had in this command, and that I'm aware I can't argue you into staying if you've decided." "I've decided," Mason said. "Transition Assistance Office is in Building 6. Tell them I sent you. They'll do it right." He extended his hand. Mason shook it. "Take care of the dog," Hartwell said. "That's the plan," Mason said. Briggs found him by the truck at 11:15, when most of the crowd had dispersed, and Atlas was loaded in the back seat again with his chin on the door armrest, monitoring the parking lot with professional interest. Briggs leaned against the truck beside him and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. "Alvarez knows," Briggs said. "See, I talked to him yesterday. Kellner, the shrapnel. They told him." Mason looked at the truck. "How'd he take it?" "About how you'd expect." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He's angry. He's going to be angry for a while. That's fair. Yeah. He asked about you, whether you were the one who uncovered it. What'd you tell him? I told him the dog found it first. Briggs glanced sideways. He laughed. First thing he's laughed about in months, from what I hear. Mason nodded. Are you actually going? Briggs said. The transition paperwork. Devereaux heard something. Devereaux hears everything. He does. Briggs turned to face him. So? Yeah, Mason said. I'm going. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who doesn't have words, but the silence of someone choosing which ones to use. You've been doing this for 12 years, Briggs said. I know. It's going to be weird, not having a mission cycle, not having a unit. Probably. Mason looked through the window at Atlas, who had noticed the conversation and was watching both of them. I've got a mission cycle. Briggs looked at Atlas, then back at Mason. Yeah, he said. I guess you do. He put out his hand. Mason shook it, and Briggs gripped it for a second longer than a standard handshake, and then let go and stepped back and did the thing that people who have been through hard things together sometimes do. He looked away at the middle distance, jaw working slightly, and then composed himself and looked back. Call me when you're settled, Briggs said. I will. I mean it. Don't just say it. I mean it too. Mason opened the driver's door. You'll be the second call I make. Who's the first? Mason tilted his head toward the back seat. Briggs shook his head once and walked away, hands in his pockets. The property was 40 minutes from the coast, which was close enough that on a clear day you could smell salt in the air if the wind was right. It was not perfect. The previous owners had left it in a condition that was honest about the years it had accumulated. A fence along the south side that needed 2 new posts, a porch step that depressed in the middle underweight, a kitchen that had been updated approximately once in 30 years and was functional without being pleasant about it. The yard was large and largely overgrown, the kind of grass that had decided its own schedule some time ago. Mason spent the first 3 days there fixing the fence posts and the porch step and leaving the kitchen alone for the moment because some things were a problem for a different week. Atlas spent the first 3 days covering the property in a systematic, thorough pattern that Mason recognized as the same grid search behavior he applied to new operational environments. Moving in overlapping passes, establishing reference points, building a map of the space and whatever internal architecture he used for that purpose. He checked the fence line. He located the tree at the north edge of the yard with the particular interest of something that had been marked by other animals and needed to be addressed. He identified the drainage ditch along the east side as a feature of significant olfactory interest and returned to it multiple times. By the end of the 3rd day, he had decided the property was acceptable. He demonstrated this by choosing a specific patch of afternoon sunlight on the back porch and lying down in it with a certainty that communicated ownership. Mason sat in the other chair on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched him. Atlas's scar was healing well. He moved without favoring his right side anymore. Not the full fluid speed of his prime, not yet, maybe never entirely, but solid and confident and completely himself. He'd stopped moving carefully. That had been the sign Mason was watching for, the moment when Atlas stopped performing adequacy and started just living. It had happened on day 2. The coast was visible from the end of the property's dirt access road, a thin blue line at the horizon that the light hit differently at different hours. In the morning, it was gray and flat. In the late afternoon, it caught gold. At night, it disappeared entirely, and you knew it was there only by the sound. Mason had grown up 50 miles from the ocean and had spent 12 years in places where the horizon was always either mountain or desert or urban and never water. And something about having it visible again did something to his internal calibration that he couldn't articulate but could feel, a loosening of something in his chest that he hadn't fully recognized as tight until it started to ease. He was not entirely okay yet. He was aware of that. There were mornings when he woke up from no dream he could remember with his hands already moving, already checking, reaching for something that wasn't there. There were moments when the sound of a vehicle backfiring on the road produced a half-second of something that he handled and set aside but couldn't prevent. There were days when the absence of a mission cycle created a silence that was peaceful on the surface and had complicated textures underneath. He was working on it. There was a therapist in the coastal town 12 miles east who had experience with returning veterans and who had a direct, unhurried quality that Mason found he could deal with. He went on Tuesdays. It was not perfect and he was not fixed, and that was fine. He was present and he was moving, and Atlas was alive, and those facts together were sufficient. 6 weeks after the move, a letter arrived from the unit's administrative office, formal, on official letterhead, notifying him that Staff Sergeant Grant Voss had been charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice on 4 counts, including passing classified operational intelligence to a foreign commercial entity, conduct unbecoming, and 2 counts related to the deliberate discharge of a weapon in the direction of a fellow service member. The NCIS investigation had additionally produced federal charges related to the civilian criminal network, coordinated with the Department of Justice. The letter noted that Mason would be contacted regarding his role as a material witness. He read it on the back porch while Atlas sat in his sunlight patch. Then he folded it, put it on the inside table, and went back outside. He didn't feel satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction implied a clean finish, and nothing about this was clean. Alvarez's hand would never be fully what it was. The 7 months of compromised operations would leave marks that the investigations couldn't entirely excavate. And whatever Voss had been before he became what he became was its own kind of loss. The system would do what the system did, and the outcome would be correct and would not fix everything, because correct outcomes rarely did. What Mason felt was simpler and more durable than satisfaction. He sat down. Atlas opened one eye, assessed him, and closed it again. Voss got charged, Mason said. Atlas's ear moved. 4 counts. Federal charges on top. He leaned back in the chair. I thought I'd feel more about it. Right now, I mostly feel tired. Atlas shifted his position slightly in the sunlight, adjusting his angle for maximum coverage. That's probably the right call, Mason said. Kowalski came to visit in the 7th week, appearing in Mason's driveway on a Saturday morning in a civilian car that looked like it had been chosen for fuel efficiency rather than any other reason. He got out carrying a 6-pack of something cold and a flash drive that he held up when Mason opened the door. Full analysis report, Kowalski said. Official version. You're listed as the initiating party. I wanted you to have a copy that doesn't live only in a government system. Mason took both items. You drove 40 minutes for that. I was in the area. Kowalski looked past him at the property. Also, I wanted to see if the dog was actually okay. He's on the porch. They went around to the back. Atlas registered Kowalski's arrival with the careful, neutral assessment he gave to people he had met once under stressful circumstances and was evaluating on a clean basis. He sniffed the air, looked at Kowalski, decided something, and went back to his sunlight. High praise, Mason said. I'll take it. Kowalski sat in the other chair. How's civilian life? Weird. Mason handed him one of the bottles from the 6-pack. Getting less weird. The fence looks new. 2 posts. Kowalski looked out at the yard, at the tree at the north edge, at the thin blue line of the coast visible over the property's end. Not bad, he said. No, Mason said. Not bad. They drank in silence for a while. It was comfortable silence, the kind between people who have been through something together and don't need to reconstruct it in conversation because it lives in both of them already. At some point, Atlas got up from his patch, walked across the porch, and lay down between their 2 chairs. Kowalski looked down at him, at the fur grown back over the scar, at the steady rise and fall of his chest, at the particular quality of settled alertness that Atlas carried even at rest. He did something impossible, Kowalski said quietly. And then he did it for 17 more days. Yeah, Mason said. The unit's going to talk about that dog for a long time. He'd be irritated by that. Mason looked down at Atlas. He never understood why doing your job was a thing that needed talking about. Kowalski considered this. Maybe that's the point. Mason didn't answer. He looked out at the thin line of the coast, at the afternoon light on the water, at the uncomplicated fact of the afternoon. Atlas breathed slowly between the 2 chairs, warm in the sun, his side rising and falling with the easy regularity of something that had earned its rest. There was a commendation on the wall inside, framed, official, the meritorious service medal mounted beside it. Mason had put it there because Atlas deserved to have it somewhere visible, even if Atlas himself had no use for it. There was a ceramic bowl by the kitchen door with Atlas's name on it, bought at a shop in the coastal town by a person who had never expected to be buying a ceramic bowl in a coastal town shop. There was a fence with 2 new posts and a porch step that no longer depressed in the middle, and a kitchen that was still a problem for a different week. There was a dog who had walked through a surgery with 60-40 odds and come out the other side with his character entirely intact. No bitterness, no hesitation, no diminishment of the thing in him that had always made him what he was. And there was Mason, who was tired and present and working on it, sitting on a porch in the afternoon light, figuring out what a person does after the mission ends. It turned out what a person did was this. They stayed. The investigation concluded 4 months later. Voss received a federal sentence of 11 years with a dishonorable discharge and forfeiture of all military benefits. The network he'd been connected to saw 3 additional arrests across 2 states. The CI team's 14-month operation, accelerated by Voss's communications record, produced a final case that the Justice Department described in their press release as one of the largest domestic military intelligence compromise cases in the previous decade. Mason read about it on his phone at the kitchen table, with Atlas asleep on the floor nearby, with coffee that had gone cold while he wasn't paying attention, with the sound of wind off the coast moving through the yard outside. He put the phone face down, looked at Atlas. The dog was dreaming, his paws making small contained movements, his muzzle twitching, running something in his sleep the way he always had. Whatever it was, he was moving confidently. No hesitation, no catch in the motion. Mason picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, and drank it anyway. Outside, the wind off the coast ran through the overgrown yard grass in a long, even wave and kept going. Atlas kept dreaming. Mason sat in the quiet and let the morning be what it was. Bakmas. The ones who protect us without asking for recognition are not rare. They are simply the ones we forget to look for. Look for them.